There are interviews that begin with a few harmless questions, a little laughter, and a celebrity promoting a new project. And then there are moments when the conversation takes a turn nobody expected. In this fictionalized scenario, Nicolas Cage walks into The View expecting a familiar daytime television interview. But what follows becomes a tense battle over criticism, creativity, and respect. At first, everything seems normal. Cage is relaxed, Joy Behar is doing what she does best, and the conversation appears to be heading toward his career and latest work. But then Joy starts pushing. One question becomes another. A joke becomes a criticism. And suddenly, the discussion is no longer about a movie. It becomes personal. Joy challenges Cage's unconventional career choices. She questions his acting style, his reputation, and the strange decisions that have made him one of Hollywood's most unpredictable performers. Cage initially answers with patience, refusing to take the bait. But with every new remark, the tension grows. Then something changes. The man known for explosive performances suddenly becomes completely serious. His voice becomes calmer. His answers become sharper. And instead of simply defending his movies, Cage begins questioning the very idea of what criticism is supposed to accomplish. That's when the entire conversation takes a dramatic turn. Because Cage isn't just defending an acting career anymore. He's defending the right to be different, to take creative risks, to fail publicly, and to create something that won't necessarily fit everyone's expectations. And Joy isn't backing down either. So how does Cage respond when the jokes stop being jokes? And what happens when the guest who was supposed to answer the questions suddenly starts asking questions of his own? This is the moment when the interview changes completely, and neither side seems willing to back down. For Nicolas Cage, being unpredictable has never simply been part of his image. It has become one of the defining characteristics of his career. From intense dramatic performances to wildly unconventional roles, Cage has repeatedly chosen projects that refuse to fit neatly into Hollywood's expectations. That willingness to take risks has earned him devoted fans, harsh critics, and a reputation for doing things his own way. Talk about his career, discuss his latest project, and perhaps exchange a few jokes with the hosts. But Joy Behar has a different idea. Known for asking provocative questions and challenging her guests, Joy begins steering the conversation toward Cage's unusual career decisions. At first, Cage appears willing to play along. He smiles. He answers carefully. He doesn't seem interested in creating a confrontation. But the questions become increasingly personal. Instead of focusing entirely on his work, the conversation begins touching on his financial decisions, his unconventional film choices, his acting style, and the criticism that has followed him throughout his career. Each question seems designed to provoke a stronger reaction. Cage doesn't immediately give her one. And that is what makes the tension even more interesting. Rather than exploding, he listens. He considers each remark. Then he answers with a calmness that suggests he isn't simply trying to survive the interview. He is studying the argument taking shape in front of him. Joy continues pressing. The other hosts begin noticing the shift in atmosphere. What was supposed to be an ordinary celebrity interview is slowly becoming something much more uncomfortable. At the heart of the conflict is a question bigger than Cage himself. When does criticism stop being honest and start becoming personal? Joy believes a public figure should be able to withstand tough questions. Cage believes an artist should be allowed to take risks without having every unconventional choice turned into an excuse for ridicule. And as the conversation moves forward, those two philosophies are about to collide head-on. The conversation begins innocently enough. Joy Behar looks toward Nicolas Cage with a familiar smile and starts asking about his career. For a few moments, everything feels comfortable. Cage answers thoughtfully, discussing the unpredictability of Hollywood and the importance of choosing projects that genuinely interest him. Then Joy shifts the subject. Instead of asking about his latest work, she brings up some of the unconventional decisions Cage has made throughout his career. His unusual purchases, his willingness to accept strange roles, and the public perception that he sometimes makes choices other actors would never consider. The question sounds playful, but the implication behind it is harder to ignore. Joy suggests that perhaps Cage's unusual decisions reveal something about his judgment. The audience reacts with scattered laughter, expecting Cage to laugh along. He doesn't. Cage pauses for a moment before answering. Unusual doesn't automatically mean irresponsible, he explains calmly. I've made decisions that didn't work out. Everyone has. But that doesn't mean every decision deserves to be reduced to a joke. Joy smiles and pushes back. But you have to admit, Nicholas, some of your choices are pretty wild. Cage nods slightly. Of course they're wild. That's part of taking risks. That answer changes the tone. Instead of becoming defensive, Cage turns the criticism into a broader point. He explains that people often judge decisions only after seeing the result. If something succeeds, it's called bold. If it fails, it's called foolish. Joy isn't convinced. She jokes that Cage has made a career out of doing things nobody else would consider sensible. The audience laughs again, but this time Cage's expression remains serious. He looks directly at her. You can disagree with my choices, he says, but disagreement isn't the same thing as understanding them. For the first time, the other hosts sense that the conversation may be heading somewhere dangerous. Joy has asked the first personal question, and Cage has made it clear that he's willing to answer, but he won't simply sit there and be mocked. Joy doesn't let the conversation settle. After challenging Cage's personal choices, she turns her attention toward the one subject she knows will provoke an even stronger reaction: his movies. With a teasing smile, she begins listing some of his more unusual roles and asks whether he ever worries that audiences have stopped taking him seriously. The question is delivered almost like a joke, but the message underneath it is unmistakable. Joy isn't simply asking about his films. She's questioning his artistic judgment. Cage listens without interrupting. Then Joy pushes further, suggesting that some of his performances have become so exaggerated that audiences sometimes wonder whether he's actually acting or simply playing an exaggerated version of himself. The audience laughs. Cage doesn't. He takes a breath before responding. I've never believed an actor should repeat the same safe formula just because people are comfortable with it, he says. Sometimes you have to take a chance on something strange. Joy immediately counters that taking chances doesn't automatically make a movie good. Cage agrees. Of course it doesn't. That answer catches her off guard. He explains that not every experiment succeeds. Some films connect with audiences. Others don't. But failure doesn't erase the effort behind the work. Joy shakes her head and suggests that audiences shouldn't have to admire something simply because an actor calls it artistic. Cage leans forward slightly. They don't have to admire it, he replies. They don't even have to like it. But there's a difference between saying you dislike something and saying the person who created it has no value. The atmosphere changes. Joy's smile fades slightly. She argues that public figures should expect criticism when they put their work in front of millions of people. Cage agrees again, but then makes his distinction clear. Criticism is part of the job. Disrespect doesn't have to be. For a moment, nobody interrupts. The disagreement has moved beyond movies. It has become a debate about what artists owe their audiences, and what audiences owe the people brave enough to create something in the first place. And Joy isn't finished testing that boundary. Joy decides that simply criticizing Cage's movies isn't enough. She turns directly toward his acting style. With a half smile, she suggests that perhaps Cage has developed such a recognizable way of performing that audiences sometimes aren't sure where the character ends and Nicolas Cage begins. The remark gets a laugh from the studio. Cage remains still. Joy continues. She brings up his tendency to deliver intense expressions, dramatic reactions, and performances that can feel completely different from what audiences expect. Then she asks the question that changes the atmosphere. Do you ever worry that people aren't seeing the character anymore? They're just seeing Nicolas Cage. For several seconds, Cage says nothing. Then he slowly leans forward. I've never been interested in making every performance comfortable, he says. If an audience knows exactly what I'm going to do before I do it, then I've already failed the experiment. Joy raises an eyebrow. Experiment. Cage explains that acting isn't about making everyone agree with your choices. It's about entering a character, finding an emotional truth, and sometimes going somewhere unexpected. Joy isn't convinced. She argues that there is a difference between being unconventional and simply being excessive. That word catches Cage's attention. Excessive, he repeats. Joy nods. She suggests that some viewers might interpret his most intense performances as overacting rather than serious craftsmanship. Cage doesn't raise his voice. Instead, he becomes noticeably calmer. That's the risk, he says. When you commit completely, some people will think you've gone too far. Others will see something they haven't experienced before. You can't control which reaction someone has. The response creates an uncomfortable silence. For the first time, Joy has pushed Cage into explaining something deeper than a particular movie. He's explaining why he refuses to play it safe. He tells her that actors have to be willing to look strange, vulnerable, imperfect, and even ridiculous if the role demands it. Joy responds that audiences shouldn't have to call something brilliant simply because an actor calls it art. Cage nods. Absolutely. Then he adds one final thought. You don't have to love my choices. But if you're going to criticize them, at least understand that those choices were made deliberately. The room goes quiet again. The argument has officially moved from whether Cage's movies are good to whether his entire approach to acting deserves respect. And that is a much harder question to dismiss. By this point, the conversation is no longer about one movie. Joy Behar has challenged Cage's choices, his films, and now his entire approach to acting. Cage has remained controlled, but something in his responses suggests that his patience is beginning to run thin. Joy leans into the argument. She insists that criticism is part of being famous. If Cage chooses to work in front of millions of people, she argues, he can't expect everyone to praise his decisions. Viewers have opinions, critics have opinions, and hosts have the right to express those opinions. Cage agrees with the first part. Then he challenges the second. Of course people can criticize my work, he says. That's part of being an artist. But criticism should be about the work, not an excuse to attack the person behind it. Joy immediately pushes back. She argues that public figures shouldn't become offended simply because someone asks uncomfortable questions. Cage looks at her carefully. An uncomfortable question isn't the problem, he replies. The problem is when the question is designed to embarrass rather than understand. That statement changes the direction of the conversation. Joy argues that provocative interviews create discussion. Without challenging questions, she says, celebrity interviews become nothing more than publicity appearances. Cage doesn't disagree. But he asks whether provoking someone is automatically the same as having a meaningful conversation. The other hosts begin watching the exchange closely. Cage continues, explaining that artists already expose themselves every time they perform. They risk rejection, failure, ridicule, and disappointment. In his view, that vulnerability deserves at least some recognition, even when the final product isn't successful. Joy counters that vulnerability doesn't place an artist above criticism. Cage immediately agrees. No, he says. It doesn't. Then his tone becomes more serious. But criticism should challenge an idea. It shouldn't diminish a human being. For a moment, Joy has no immediate response. The disagreement has reached its central point. Joy believes honesty requires saying exactly what she thinks. Cage believes honesty without respect can become something else entirely. And now the question isn't whether Cage can defend his movies. It's whether he can convince Joy that there is a line between fearless criticism and unnecessary cruelty. The disagreement has now reached a deeper level. Joy is still focused on the results. If a movie fails, she argues, the audience has every right to question the decisions behind it. But Cage is focused on something different, the willingness to take the risk in the first place. He sits quietly for a moment before answering. Do you know what happens when you only make choices that are guaranteed to succeed? Cage asks. Joy raises an eyebrow. You never discover anything new. The statement hangs in the air. Cage explains that an actor's career cannot be measured entirely by box office numbers, reviews, or whether every project becomes a hit. Sometimes the most important experiences come from projects that don't work exactly as planned. Joy challenges him. But audiences don't pay for intentions, she says. They pay for the finished product. Cage nods. I understand that. Then he explains the difference between accepting criticism and being afraid of failure. He says that if an actor becomes obsessed with avoiding criticism, eventually every decision becomes calculated. The performances become safer. The choices become predictable. And the possibility of creating something genuinely unexpected disappears. Joy argues that taking risks doesn't automatically make a bad movie good. Cage agrees again. Taking a risk doesn't guarantee success. It guarantees only that you're willing to risk failure. That answer creates a different kind of silence. Cage continues, explaining that he would rather be remembered for attempting something unusual than for spending his entire career repeating the same formula because it was commercially safe. He describes acting as an act of vulnerability. An actor walks into a role without knowing exactly how audiences will respond. Sometimes the performance connects. Sometimes it doesn't. But the artist still has to commit completely. Joy looks unconvinced. She reminds him that criticism from audiences is unavoidable. Cage smiles slightly. I don't want to avoid criticism. Then his expression becomes serious. I just don't want fear of criticism to decide what I create. That sentence shifts the argument again. For Cage, the issue isn't whether every artistic choice deserves praise. It's whether an artist should stop taking chances simply because someone might laugh at the result. And now Joy faces a difficult question. Is playing it safe really wisdom, or is it simply fear disguised as common sense? Joy isn't ready to let the argument end. She returns to what she considers the strongest evidence on her side, the audience. If millions of people dislike a movie, she argues, that reaction cannot simply be dismissed as ignorance or a failure to understand artistic ambition. Audiences spend their time and money on entertainment, and they have every right to decide whether something worked for them. Cage listens carefully. Then he agrees. Absolutely. The audience gets the final choice. Joy seems satisfied for a moment. But Cage isn't finished. The audience can reject a movie, he continues, but that doesn't mean they have to reject the person who made it. Joy argues that celebrities willingly enter a public industry. Once their work becomes available to millions of people, criticism is inevitable. She says hosts like her simply give audiences a voice. Cage nods. That's fair. Then he asks a different question. What happens when criticism becomes the entertainment itself? The studio grows quieter. Joy challenges him, saying that controversy creates conversation. People tune in because they want strong opinions, not polite compliments. Cage responds that strong opinions aren't the problem. Disagreement can be valuable, he says. But disagreement doesn't require humiliation. Joy insists that she isn't humiliating anyone. She's simply refusing to pretend that every creative decision is brilliant. Cage tells her he wouldn't want that. If everyone praised everything I did, I wouldn't believe them. That answer briefly changes the energy. Cage explains that criticism can make an artist better. It can reveal weaknesses, challenge assumptions, and force creators to reconsider their choices. But criticism becomes less useful when its primary purpose is to embarrass the person being criticized. Joy argues that viewers are intelligent enough to decide for themselves. Cage agrees. Exactly. Let them decide. Then he delivers the thought that makes the room uncomfortable. Maybe the audience doesn't need us to tell them who deserves to be laughed at. For a moment, Joy says nothing. The argument has moved beyond Cage's ratings or movie reviews. Now they're debating something much larger. Whether controversy itself has become a form of entertainment, and whether a public platform should use that power to create understanding or simply generate stronger reactions. And Cage's next response is about to make the conversation even more personal. The conversation has already moved far beyond the movie Cage came to discuss. Joy has questioned his films, his acting style, and his willingness to take creative risks. Cage has answered each criticism without losing control. But then Joy makes a remark that changes the atmosphere completely. She brings up Cage's family background and suggests that his career may have benefited from connections that other actors never had. For a moment, Cage doesn't respond. The studio seems to pause with him. Joy continues, arguing that having a famous family connection can open doors in Hollywood. In her view, talent may matter, but opportunity matters too. Cage finally looks toward her. Opportunity and achievement aren't the same thing, he says. Joy challenges him. But you can't pretend those connections didn't exist. Cage agrees that his family history is part of his story. What he refuses to accept, however, is the idea that a family name automatically explains an entire career. He explains that getting an opportunity doesn't guarantee success. Once the opportunity arrives, an actor still has to walk into the room, take the role, perform under pressure, accept rejection, and continue working when projects fail. Joy argues that this is simply how Hollywood works. Cage responds that he knows exactly how Hollywood works. Then his voice becomes noticeably firmer. What I won't accept is having every accomplishment reduced to something someone else gave me. The remark lands heavily. Even the other hosts appear more cautious now. Cage explains that criticism of his performances is fair game. If someone dislikes a movie, he can accept that. If someone thinks his acting is excessive, he can live with that too. But when you start telling me that I didn't earn my career, he says, you're no longer criticizing the work. You're rewriting the person. Joy insists that she's only raising a legitimate question. Cage shakes his head. No, you're questioning whether I deserve to become who I became. The tension reaches another level. For the first time, Cage's defense isn't about a movie or an acting technique. It's about identity. And Joy has unknowingly crossed the one line that makes Cage stop explaining himself and start challenging her instead. By this point, Nicolas Cage realizes that defending himself is no longer going to change the direction of the conversation. Joy keeps returning to the same argument. If someone chooses a public career, they should be prepared for harsh opinions. Cage doesn't disagree with that principle. But then he changes the question. Instead of asking whether Joy has the right to criticize him, he asks what she intends to accomplish with that criticism. There's a difference between challenging someone and trying to make them feel small, Cage says calmly. Those two things can sound similar, but they're not the same. Joy immediately pushes back. She insists that she's simply saying what she believes. If she thinks a performance doesn't work, she shouldn't have to pretend otherwise. Cage nods. Then don't pretend. That response catches her off guard. He explains that genuine criticism can be useful. An actor can learn from disagreement. A filmmaker can learn from failure. An artist can even become stronger because someone questioned their choices. But if the goal is simply to embarrass the person, Cage continues, then what exactly are we learning? The studio becomes noticeably quieter. Joy argues that audiences enjoy honest conversations, even when those conversations become uncomfortable. Cage agrees. Uncomfortable is fine. He pauses. Disrespect isn't. That distinction becomes the heart of the argument. Cage says that every public figure has critics, but criticism should still leave room for curiosity. Instead of assuming that an unusual choice is stupid, someone could ask why the artist made it. Instead of mocking an unconventional performance, they could ask what the performer was trying to achieve. Instead of turning failure into humiliation, they could discuss what went wrong. Joy responds that this sounds idealistic. Cage smiles. Maybe it is. Then his expression becomes serious. But if we're going to have platforms where millions of people are listening, shouldn't we at least try to make the conversation mean something? For the first time, Joy's argument begins to sound less certain. Cage isn't claiming that every movie he has made is great. He's saying something much simpler. People can criticize the work without destroying the person behind it. And now the confrontation has reached its most uncomfortable question yet. If criticism is supposed to make people think, what happens when the criticism itself becomes the thing everyone is questioning? By now, neither Nicolas Cage nor Joy Behar is willing to retreat. The conversation that began with a few jokes has become a direct confrontation over criticism, creativity, and personal respect. The other hosts remain unusually quiet, watching as the two sides prepare for what feels like the final exchange. Joy makes one last argument. She insists that Cage is taking criticism too personally. In her view, anyone who works in Hollywood has to develop a thick skin. Movies can fail. Performances can be mocked. Audiences can reject an actor's choices. That's simply part of being famous. Cage listens. Then he answers without raising his voice. I've never asked people to like everything I do. Joy pauses. Cage continues. I've never asked critics to agree with me. I've never asked audiences to pretend a movie is good when they don't think it is. He leans forward slightly. All I've asked is that we remember there's a person behind the performance. The room becomes silent. Joy argues that she is simply being honest. Cage nods. Honesty matters. Then he adds, but honesty doesn't require cruelty. That sentence hangs in the air. Joy tries to respond, but Cage continues, explaining that an artist's greatest vulnerability is putting something personal into the world and allowing millions of strangers to judge it. You can criticize my performance, he says. You can criticize my choices. You can even say you think I failed. I'll listen. His voice becomes firmer. But don't tell me that taking a risk was a mistake simply because the result wasn't what you expected. Joy looks toward him, visibly frustrated. Cage doesn't attack her personally. Instead, he turns the question back toward the purpose of the conversation. If we're going to disagree, let's disagree about ideas. Let's talk about the work. Let's challenge each other. But let's not confuse humiliation with honesty. For several seconds, nobody says anything. The tension has reached its highest point. Cage has stopped defending individual movies. He is defending something much larger. The right to create without being reduced to the failures, criticism, or expectations surrounding that creation. And now Joy has one final opportunity to answer. But this time, the entire studio is waiting to hear what she will say. For several seconds, the studio remains completely quiet. The argument has reached a point where another insult could easily turn the entire conversation into something even more chaotic. Joy Behar appears ready to respond, but Nicolas Cage doesn't give her another opportunity to pull him back into the same cycle. Instead, he takes a breath. His expression changes. The anger that had been visible earlier is replaced by something much calmer. "I think we've reached the point where we're no longer talking about the movie," he says. Joy looks toward him. Cage continues. "We're talking about whether two people can disagree without trying to destroy each other." The statement changes the mood. Joy insists that she never intended to destroy him. She says she was doing her job, asking difficult questions and giving her honest opinion. Cage nods. "And that's your right." For a moment, it seems as though the confrontation might finally settle down. But Cage isn't finished. He explains that he can accept criticism because criticism is part of being an artist. What he refuses to accept is the idea that an artist has to apologize for being unconventional. "I've made strange choices," he says. "I've made choices people didn't understand. I've made mistakes. But I would rather make mistakes while trying something than spend my life terrified of being judged." Joy doesn't immediately respond. Cage then turns the entire confrontation into one final message. "People don't have to love what I create. They don't even have to understand it. But I hope they can recognize that I gave it everything I had." The words land differently from everything that came before. There is no shouting now. No insult. No attempt to win. Just a final statement from someone who has decided that continuing the argument would accomplish nothing. Cage straightens his jacket and prepares to leave. "Thank you for the conversation," he says calmly. "I mean that." Joy looks surprised by the sudden politeness. Cage steps away from the discussion, leaving behind a studio filled with an uncomfortable silence. The fictionalized confrontation doesn't end with a dramatic victory speech. It ends with restraint. And perhaps that's what makes the moment most powerful. Because after spending the entire conversation defending his right to take risks, Cage finally demonstrates that principle himself. He refuses to let anger decide his final move. And the question left hanging in the air is simple. Was walking away the strongest response of all? Because beneath all the arguments was something far more human. Cage wasn't asking everyone to agree with him. He wasn't demanding that critics praise every performance or that audiences love every movie he makes. His argument was about something much simpler: the difference between criticism and contempt. Criticism can challenge an artist. It can expose weaknesses, encourage improvement, and force someone to look at their work from another perspective. But when criticism becomes personal, the conversation changes. Instead of discussing the work, people begin attacking the person. Joy represents the belief that honesty sometimes requires saying exactly what you think, even when the truth is uncomfortable. Cage represents another perspective, that honesty becomes more meaningful when it is combined with respect. Neither side has to agree with the other. But disagreement doesn't have to become destruction. That's the deeper lesson behind the confrontation. Cage's greatest strength wasn't simply the intensity of his words. It was his refusal to allow someone else's opinion to define his identity. He acknowledged his failures, accepted that some people wouldn't like his choices, and still refused to stop taking creative risks. And perhaps that's why unconventional artists continue to fascinate audiences. They remind us that creativity isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it looks strange. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes it divides people completely. But without people willing to risk embarrassment, rejection, and failure, there would be far fewer original ideas in the world. So, in this fictionalized scenario, the real question isn't whether Nicolas Cage won the argument. It's this: can you defend what you believe without becoming the thing you're fighting against? What do you think? Was Cage right to push back, or did the confrontation go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy dramatic celebrity stories like this, make sure to subscribe for the next one.